did not look at my brother when he said it. I kept my eyes on the grain of the wood on the table in front of me, counting the lines in it the way I used to count ceiling tiles in the hospital waiting room the night our mother had her first stroke. Old habit. When everything around you is falling apart, you find something small and fixed to hold on to. He said it clearly, loudly, with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who has never once been caught in a lie. She hasn't held a real job in over 8 years. Our mother knew it. That's why the clause is in the will. Audrey has been living off this family her entire adult life, and now she wants to take what little is left of it. I heard the words. I felt the jury shift, and I still did not look at him. My mother's name was Helen Mercer. She was a practical woman, the kind who kept a savings account nobody knew about, who wrote thank you notes by hand, who never said, "I love you," without meaning it exactly. She grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, moved to Ottawa after she married my father, and spent 31 years building a life around 2 kids and a house on a street where everyone knew your name and nobody locked their doors. My father passed when I was 19. My brother Colin was 24. After that, Colin became something else. He didn't grieve exactly. He reorganized. He stepped into the space my father left and decided, without asking anyone, that he was now the one in charge of the house, of our mother's finances, of me. I didn't fight it then. I was 19. I was in my second year at Carleton. I had a part-time job at a bookstore on Bank Street, and I was mostly just trying to get through each day without crying in the library. Colin managing things felt like one less thing I had to carry. That was my first mistake. I graduated with a degree in criminology. Colin thought it was a joke. "What are you going to do with that?" he said at dinner one night. Not even a question, just a flat dismissal. Become a crossing guard? I got a job 6 months later with the federal government. Entry level, nothing flashy. Policy analysis. I told my mother I worked in public safety administration. That was true. It was also the most I could say. The nature of my work required discretion. That's the word they used in orientation. Discretion. What it meant in practice was that I couldn't tell my family what I actually did, where I actually went, or why I sometimes disappeared for weeks at a time without a forwarding number. My mother never asked. I think she understood more than she let on. She had a way of looking at me when I came home, a little thinner, a little quieter, where she would just put her hand on mine at the kitchen table and say, "You hungry?" She never pushed. She trusted me. Colin, on the other hand, decided that my silence was evidence. Evidence of failure, of shame, of a daughter who couldn't hold her life together and was quietly bleeding the family dry while pretending to have a career in Ottawa. "She's always vague about what she does," he told our mother once when he didn't know I was in the hallway. "That's because there's nothing to say. She's probably been on EI half the time and too proud to admit it." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. Then I walked back to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and said nothing. That was not a mistake. That was a choice. There is a difference. My mother had her second stroke in January 3 years ago. She recovered partially, her speech came back. Her right hand never quite did. I took 4 weeks of personal leave and came home to Canada to help set up the house for her new needs. I pay for the occupational therapist out of my own pocket because the wait time through OHIP was 4 months, and my mother needed help now. I didn't mention the money. It wasn't about the money. Colin noticed that things were getting done. He did not ask how. Over the next year, I quietly covered her property tax deferral when the application got rejected. I arranged and paid for her prescription delivery. When the furnace broke in February, I called the technician and gave them my credit card number over the phone from a hotel room in another city. When my mother asked who had paid for it, I told her the warranty had covered it. She looked at me for a long moment. She knew. She updated her will 6 weeks later. I found out what was in the will the same day Colin did, at the reading, in a lawyer's office on Elgin Street in March of last year. Our mother left the house to both of us equally. She left her personal savings, approximately $94,000, split evenly. She left her jewelry to me and her workshop tools to Colin because she knew us. And she added a clause. a requirement that any beneficiary contesting the will or bringing legal action against another beneficiary would forfeit their share entirely. Colin lasted 11 days before he filed. His claim was that I had exercised undue influence over our mother in her final years, that I had isolated her from family, from him, specifically, and manipulated her into favoring me in the estate. That money had gone missing from her accounts during the years I was most involved in her care. That I had, in plain language, stolen from a woman who trusted me. He had a lawyer named Mr. Hargrove who wore pocket squares and spoke very slowly, as if everyone in the room needed extra time to absorb how clever he was. I had a lawyer named Susan Park, who wore her hair in a low bun and never raised her voice above what was necessary. I trusted Susan completely. I told her everything. Well, almost everything. The hearing was in a courtroom in Ottawa, a Thursday in late October. The kind of day where the sky outside is that flat gray that makes everything feel like a waiting room. I wore navy. I sat with my hands on the table and my back straight. Colin sat across from me. He had a new haircut. He looked, I thought, like a man who had already decided how this would end. Mr. Hargrove called Colin first. He was asked about our mother's final years, about her mental state, about her mental state, about her mental state, about the influence I had allegedly exerted. Colin was calm, measured, specific. He had clearly practiced. He said he had tried many times to reach our mother and been told she wasn't available. He said he had noticed changes in her financial statements. He was a co-signatory on her checking account from 2019 and had flagged his concerns to no one because he didn't want to cause trouble. He said he believed his sister had always resented him, had always been the favorite, and had taken advantage of an elderly woman's trust for personal gain. He said all of this under oath. I watched him the way you watch a road you've driven 100 times, noting where the ice tends to form. Then Mr. Hargrove called me. He approached with the relaxed energy of someone who considered this part a formality. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "can you describe for the court your current employment?" "I work in federal operations," I said. "Federal operations," he let that sit. "Can you be more specific?" "Not in this setting, no." He smiled, not warmly. "So to the court's knowledge, you cannot produce a T4, a pay stub, a letter of employment, any documentation confirming that you have held what I would call verifiable employment in the past 8 years. "I can confirm that I'm employed and have been continuously," I said. "The documentation supporting that is classified." He turned to the judge as if sharing a private joke. "Classified, of course." Then back to me. "Your mother had an active employment clause in her estate, specifically that beneficiaries must demonstrate stable employment or community contribution. It was her wish. Given that you cannot demonstrate employment to this court's satisfaction, does that concern you?" "My employment is stable," I said. "It is the disclosure that is restricted, not the employment itself." "Your Honor," Mr. Hargrove said, pivoting neatly, "I'd like to suggest that the witness's reluctance to provide any documentation is itself a pattern consistent with someone who has something to conceal." Susan stood up. "Your Honor, the defense requests permission to submit a document to the court at this time. It has been cleared through the appropriate federal channels and is addressed to you directly in your capacity as presiding judge." Mr. Hargrove looked at her. "What document?" "It will be submitted to the judge," Susan said. "Directly." What happened next, I had known was coming. Susan and I had worked through this carefully over several weeks. There were phone calls with people I cannot name, and a process that took longer than either of us wanted, and a clearance that I wasn't sure would come through in time. It came through on a Wednesday. Susan called me at 7 in the morning. She said simply, "It's here." The document was a sealed letter, government letterhead, addressed to the presiding judge by name, which itself requires a level of coordination most people would find surprising. It confirmed my employment, my security clearance level, and the reason that no public documentation of my work could be produced in open court. It also confirmed my total compensation for the previous 8 years, which I will not repeat here, but which Mr. Pav Hargrove's expression, when the judge read from it quietly to himself, made clear, was not what he had expected. The judge read it. He set it down. He looked at me for a moment. Not with recognition, exactly. He was too careful for that, but with a slight recalibration. The way people look at something they have just reassessed. He looked at Mr. Hargrove. "Counsel," he said, "I'm going to suggest that we take a brief recess." The recess was 20 minutes. Colin found me in the corridor. He looked for the first time that day, uncertain. "What was in that letter?" he asked. I looked at him. My brother. The boy I used to race across the backyard with. The one who taught me how to ride a bike on the hill behind the school. The one who handed me a box of tissues at our father's funeral and said nothing, and somehow that was exactly right. The one who stood in a courtroom and told 12 strangers I had stolen from our mother. "You'll hear soon enough," I said. I walked back to the courtroom. The judge did not reveal the contents of the letter in open court. That was part of the arrangement. What he did was rule, clearly and without ambiguity, that the employment clause in my mother's will had been satisfied. He entered into record that the claimant's central allegation, that I lacked verifiable employment and had therefore acted outside the scope of legitimate beneficiary status, had been disproven to the court's satisfaction through documentation the court was not at liberty to disclose. He then turned to the matter of the financial transfers Colin had flagged. Susan had prepared for this. We had bank records, e-transfer confirmations, invoices from the furnace company, receipts from the pharmacy, the occupational therapist's billing statements, all of it showing money going in to support my mother's care. None of it showing a single dollar coming out in my direction. Mr. Hargrove tried to reframe this as evidence of control rather than contribution. It didn't land. You could feel the shift in the room. The judge dismissed the claim. Colin's legal challenge had triggered the forfeiture clause our mother had written into the will. He received nothing. I want to be careful here, because I know what you might be expecting. You might expect me to say that I felt vindicated, triumphant, that walking out of that courtroom felt like something out of a film. It didn't. It felt like the end of something that should never have started. I sat in my car in the parking garage on Queen Street for about 15 minutes before I could drive. I didn't cry. I just sat there with the engine off, watching the orange light of the garage ceiling and thinking about my mother's kitchen. The way it smelled in winter when she had soup on the stove, the way she always had a second mug ready on the counter before you even asked for tea. She knew who I was. She always knew. She just never asked me to prove it. That, I think, is what hurt the most about all of it. Not Colin's accusations. Not Mr. Hargrove's slow, smiling condescension. Not the months of legal stress and late-night phone calls with Susan going over documents I had to summarize in careful, sanitized language. What hurt was that my mother spent her last years having to quietly compensate for a family that couldn't see her daughter clearly, and she had to do it alone, and clauses and codicils, because I wasn't allowed to tell them the truth. She did it anyway. Quietly, practically, the way she did everything. Colin called me 2 weeks after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was about 3 minutes long. I listened to it once. He said a lot of things. That he'd been misled by his lawyer. That he hadn't understood the forfeiture clause. That he had been genuinely worried about our mother and his intentions had never been malicious. He did not apologize. I saved the message. I don't know why. Not for any strategic reason. I think because some part of me is still waiting for the version of him that showed up with tissues at the funeral. I'm not sure that version is still there, but I am not ready to stop waiting for it entirely. That's the part nobody tells you about this kind of story. That winning doesn't feel the way you think it will. That justice, when it arrives, is quieter than you expected. And it doesn't fill the space the grief left behind. I drove back to Ottawa that evening. Stopped at a Tim Hortons, just past Carleton Place. Old habit, highway drive, large dark roast. Sat in the parking lot for a minute before pulling back onto the 417. My phone lit up with a message from Susan. "Everything's filed. You're done. Get some rest." I looked at it for a moment, then I put the car in drive. My mother's house sold 4 months later. My half of the proceeds went into a savings account I haven't touched. I'm not sure what I'm saving it for. Something that feels right. Something she would have approved of. Practical and quiet and built to last. I still have her second mug. It's in my cupboard in Ottawa, next to mine. Every morning it's there, and every morning that's enough. There's a mug in my cupboard that I haven't moved in 2 years. It sits next to mine every morning, and most days I don't think about it consciously. I just reach past it, fill my own, and stand at the counter while the city outside is still quiet. But some mornings I look at it and I think about my mother at her kitchen table, and I think about how little it takes to either honor someone or betray them. Colin chose to betray her. Not all at once. I don't think it started that way. I think it started small, with assumptions he never questioned, and a version of me he decided on years ago and never updated. He saw a sister who was vague about her work, who came and went without explanation, who didn't fit the shape of success he recognized, and he filled in the gaps with what was convenient. That's not a mystery. People do it all the time. The problem is when you're willing to stand in a courtroom and swear to those assumptions under oath. What happened to Colin wasn't punishment from some outside force. It was the direct result of his own choices, stacked one on top of the other. He filed a claim he couldn't support. He triggered a clause our mother had written specifically because she understood, even then, what he was capable of. He lost everything she had intended for him, not because I took it, but because he reached for something that wasn't his, and in doing so, let go of what was. That's not fate. That's cause and effect, plain and simple. I've thought a lot about what kept me steady through all of it. It wasn't confidence exactly. There were nights I wasn't sure the clearance would come through in time. Nights I sat with Susan on the phone going over documents I could only describe in the vaguest terms, wondering if the truth I knew about myself would ever be allowed to speak in a room where I needed it most. What kept me steady was something quieter than confidence. It was knowing that I had done the right thing consistently, over years, without an audience. I had paid the furnace bill. I had arranged the therapist. I had made sure my mother had what she needed, not so that I could prove it later, but because it was the right thing to do. That foundation doesn't shake easily. When you've been honest in the dark, you don't panic as much when someone turns the lights on. And I think that's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom moment, not the judge's expression, not the look on Mr. Hargrove's face when the letter landed. Those are just moments. What mattered was the 8 years before them, the choices I made when no one was watching, the discipline of doing good work without recognition, the patience to let the truth exist quietly until it was needed. My mother built her whole life that way. Practical, steady, no performance. She updated her will not out of sentiment, but out of clear-eyed understanding of what was true. She trusted me not because I told her to, but because I had shown her who I was, repeatedly, in small ways, over a long time. That's the only kind of trust that holds. I think about that when I look at the mug. I think about the kind of person I want to keep being, not for any courtroom, not for any inheritance, but because a woman who loved me quietly and completely deserved a daughter who tried to be worth it. Most mornings, that feels like enough.